About potential operational delineations. And as you can see from the title slide here, kind of on-the-ground experiences and future directions. So it's kind of pairing both the science and the management. Oftentimes they occur in silos, and myself and the folks that I work with, the other folks on the call now, really try and make sure they're integrated as much as possible. Science has a lot to learn from management. Management has a lot to learn from science. Obviously, that goes back and forth, as you all are well aware. We introduced the speakers, and here's just a quick overview of what we're going to cover. It'll be roughly 1 hour. We will have some time for questions. I'm going to give a quick introduction to potential operational delineations. I'm assuming some of you have heard of pods and maybe others not so much. And so we'll give a quick overview of what pods are, how they're being used, why we think they add value. We're going to kick it over to Jamie Long for the middle, kind of the applications and the lessons learned. Pods are being rolled out across the nation now, and northern New Mexico was one of the first places to really take the ball and run with it. So we really look to Jamie and his colleagues and the folks in that part of the world in order to give us some of the feedback. How is it being used? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? How can we improve it? That sort of thing. And then after we hear the local perspective, the management perspective from Jamie, it'll be Kit's turn, and he'll talk about some of the research and development, what's coming down the pipeline, what sort of research and science we're continuing in order to further this framework. And then at the end, we'll have some time for some questions. Luckily it's a small group. Some of these webinars and Zoom meetings these days are just crammed with so many people, you can hardly get a word in. So with the small group you have, I think we'll have lots of time for some good questions and maybe some discussion as well. So really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this as well. So pods, for those of you who haven't heard of them, like I said, I'll just give a quick overview. Pretty much what pods are is we're delineating potential operational units on the landscape. And the way we do this is we identify those control features on the landscape with the highest likelihood of success. These are the control features that fire managers have been identifying, searching for, and using since people have been fighting fires. The roads, the fuel type transitions, rocky outcroppings, rivers, old fire scars, anything that could potentially change or modify fire behavior, allowing for control to be more effective. We do this a couple different ways. One, we talk to those managers who are real familiar with the local landscape, and we ask them, where do you think you can hang a fire up? But we also support that with some fire modeling and spatial analysis products. We'll be discussing those in a little bit, I think, but a few of the products that we use are Suppression Difficulty Index, which is spatial model, and then the potential control line analysis. The Suppression Difficulty Index simply, it models fire behavior as well as all the conditions on the landscape that would facilitate our suppression of that fire. So we look at the fire behavior, look at the slope, we look at the distance to roads and kind of transportation network access features, line construction rates, and we get an idea of where it's going to be hard to suppress a fire and where it's likely going to be easier to suppress fire, kind of based on those models. The second product is a potential control line analysis. And that takes a slightly different approach, but kind of gets at something very similar. Where is our high likelihood for control versus where is our low likelihood of control? And what this does, it's a product that's tailored to every a specific landscape. And Kit can talk in much more detail about the nuts and bolts of the analysis. But it takes a look at historical fires, and it examines where fires have stopped and where fires have not stopped in the past. Where are fires likely to be hung up? Where are fires likely to keep on going? So it looks at all the underlying conditions of where fires have and have not stopped, the fuel type, the vegetation type, the distance to road, slope, that sort of thing. And then it creates a machine learning using a machine learning algorithm, it creates a model of which characteristics are most important in any particular landscape based on where fires have occurred. And then it applies that model to the rest of the landscape where fires have not yet occurred. And we get a good idea where fires tend to stop and where fires are not likely to stop. What we tend to see is the expert opinion, those local land managers who are familiar with managing fire in those particular landscapes, and the models have high degree of agreement. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And the two act like to validate each other. You'd have less faith if we only use one of those, but we can. When we use them both, you can kind of like triangulate where are going to be those good spots to kind of box fire in. Once we know where we can box fire in, we can start to look at all the underlying spatial data on local forest ecology, on fire behavior, on watershed values, firefighting hazards, values at risk, and we can start to kind of summarize those. A lot of that information we get from quantitative wildfire risk assessments. That same general process of aggregating that spatial data, the ecology, the fire behavior, the values at risk. And once we can kind of aggregate all that information, we can look at the pods and we can start to develop these, what we're calling strategic response zones. So, where are we likely to experience fire? What are the likely effects of that fire? We can even look at what are the likely effects of that fire under a range of fire weather conditions. One of the important things about pods is we're looking at these control lines irrespective of the jurisdictional boundaries. Fires don't know jurisdictional boundaries, so neither do the control lines. We're looking for those good places to box in a fire irrespective of who owns the land. So that said, it's a cross-boundary planning tool. We want to bring folks in to help with that from federal and non-federal agencies, and that really makes it a integrated and a useful tool. We're planning at the scale of fire instead of who owns what piece of land. Once we have that cross-boundary planning tool kind of developed from a foundational fire operations perspective, but yet integrating all the other land management concerns, you can see on the slide here, that last point, it helps with the communication, it helps with incident management, fuel treatment planning. We really think it has a lot of value helping to integrate both fire management and land management. So, this is just another quick overview is, we're trying to engage the fire before it starts. While folks might, if you're a seasoned fire manager, you might have this information in the back of your head as you're rolling up to a fire, as you're sizing it up or coming up with a plan. It's nice to have this information before the fire starts. We kind of get the information out of the heads of the local fire managers and get it into a GIS, and then it can become a planning tool. We want to in that sense, we're kind of institutionalizing that local knowledge. We're getting it out of someone's head into a GIS, onto maps, so we can share those with folks who might have expertise in a different area, but might not know fire management strategies inside and out, right? So we're kind of adding the analytics, we're adding spatial data, we're kind of leveraging local expertise, and in doing so, it becomes a communication tool. Those folks who don't have a fire background are able to understand, hey, if a fire starts here, this is where they're likely to contain it if they can't go direct for whatever reason. So it gives them insights into the fire management tactics and strategies that they might not otherwise have. And then, what we see is this is helping to improve some decisions in terms of the pre-planning, in terms of operation, in terms of the communication, and the fact that we can share this across boundaries in and outside of a particular agency kind of improves the communication. It creates a spatial decision support tool that is not making decisions for folks ahead of time, but it is providing a lot of good information for them to make informed decisions, whatever they may be. What we see on the right here in the figure is this is just one of our kind of cross-boundary workshops where folks are kind of sketching out those control lines. And then on the bottom right, this is a conceptualization of what we're calling the pod atlas. Kind of once we know where those pods are, we can kind of summarize all that spatial information. On that first slide, I showed it color-coded according to the quantitative wildfire risk assessment. This kind of takes those same inputs and kind of breaks it apart. So instead of a summary, it's all the individual layers. So what's in that pod in terms of fire ecology, in terms of fire behavior, hazards, urban interface, how many homes are there, land ownership patterns, habitat. And this is one of the products that we are co-developing with the Santa Fe and Carson National Forests. This is a product that we do have plans and are in the process of rolling out to other national forests. And we're getting feedback on them. We're seeing if and how they're used, who's using them. Here's just a quick example, kind of what that might look like. We can see there's a map of all the roads, and we can see the ownership and all the water infrastructure and the homes, the vegetation type. Recent fires and fuel treatments, might present opportunities. So instead of having to make a custom map or a series of custom maps after the fire starts, we already have something that's out of the box. It might not be perfect, but it really provides that kind of instantaneous situational awareness to give folks an idea. Okay, we have a fire. What's likely to be impacted? What do we need to prepare for? And then we do have the map of the habitat and the archaeology sites. Those are sensitive, so kind of depending on who's using this, either we can or may not want to share particular sets of information. And then here's just a few examples that kind of speak to the research team. Kit, myself, several other people are working on this. I forgot to give the credit. I forgot to credit on that first slide, but folks like Matt Thompson, Dave Calkin, Rick Stratton have all contributed a lot. So here we see the general arc of efforts. There was kind of one of the first applications of pods was in the Sierra Nevada in California. In that planning context, we see how pods and these efforts kind of fit into the larger picture of strategic planning. We need to be more strategic with our fire operations, with our fuels programs. As this season has pretty well articulated. In the middle there, engaging the fire before it starts. This speaks to that evaluation process. This was a small case study that Kit wrote up on the Tonto, who was one of the early adopters of pods. It kind of explored using several fires how pods were used, if and how they informed decisions, who used them, what decisions were being made. Over there on the fourth one in, pods and the New Mexico fire season, we did a similar approach, where we went through the process locally, and we're wanting to kind of follow up. We want to talk to the folks. So we're not just dropping a product and walking away. This is an iterative process where we say, okay, how did they work? How did this help? Maybe it didn't help, and that's fine. Either we change what we're doing or we move on to something else. We do think it has value. And then the last one here, prototyping on the geospatial atlas, that speaks to the pod atlas concept that I was showing on the last slide. So as we roll these products out, as we advance the science and work with managers, we're continuing to work with everyone in order to develop the next generation of the tools. So that's a quick overview. I'm going to kick it over to Jamie Long now, and he's going to give us a little bit more on the nuts and bolts of how this was used on his forest and with some of the fires that he was more intimately involved with.
Hey, thanks, Mike. I don't know about the nuts and bolts portion of it, but we'll do the best we can. Again, my name is Jamie Long. I am the Assistant Fire Management Officer here on the Tres District of the Carson National Forest, as well as the Incident Commander for the Northern New Mexico Type 3 team. I'm going to kind of give you what I can from the operational stance as to what I saw with the pods and as they developed through the 2019 season. So 2019 was the first year we actually were able to bring this pods concept out to light and show it to everybody. We started developing it in 2018, and I think we were still trying to figure it out ourselves and how to best utilize it. And 2019 provided a good opportunity for the all-around showing of it and using it. So with the preseason engagement that we had with the cooperator agencies and the stakeholders, we brought in both forests, the Santa Fe and the Carson, had several different meetings bringing in, BIA, local VFDs, county emergency officials. And that was the first year we were able to bring that out and bring the pods concept. And we were trying to externally communicate what it was. I think we would do better if we had a 2020 that we were actually able to do that, but unfortunately, the year had other plans for us. So with that, we had 2019 brought 7 fires that the Carson Santa Fe National Forest were able to utilize for resource benefit objectives. And we'll specifically talk about 2 of them more in detail that I can speak to as the incident commander for those 2 fires. The strategic response classification kind of provided that gut check. When we're looking at these fires and you get on scene of a initial response, you see, oh, well, it looks like it would be a good fire we could manage if certain conditions are met, was it a natural ignitions or human caused? That really determines right there from the onset whether we're going to be able to do anything for a resource benefit from there. Most of these fires on the Carson, we look at them as, there's not a whole lot of reason why we should put it out. Most of the time they're doing well for the landscape. Just been a fire adapted ecosystem that has not seen a whole lot of fire in a long time. So, we look at it as a why should we put it out first kind of response. Along with that, it kind of brings to light, when you're communicating that strategic response to the line officers, it gives you a little more traction with the initial planning that we've had for the few years before that. Going into the pod boundaries and how they were aided in defining WUFTAs, my personal opinion is yes, by design they should be. You know, whether they do truly or not, it's kind of up in the air, in my opinion. There again, with portions of the pods that were actually used as control lines, as you can look here on the map that's showing all 7 fires, all but one actually utilized some of the pod boundaries. And as Mike was saying, you know, a lot of these areas do provide a lot of good control lines, especially, you know, in certain conditions, whether it be, you know, a moderately decent fire season to, you know, great anchor points, if you will, to start continuing on with the control lines that you're looking for, whatever the season may bring. So, Mike, if you can progress on the slides. So the two we're going to talk specifically are the Goudelet and the Montoya Springs fire. Both of these, I was the incident commander for both of these fires. 2019 was really a great year for resource benefit objectives being met. The Goudelet was a mid-July, and as you can see on that bottom slide is it is the representation of what Goudelet was. Green up was occurring still. We had no real true issues throughout the fire season. Really heavy, dense mixed conifer, had an estimated 15 to 30 tons per acre, looking at a heavy dead and down component, and all the values at risk were identified by a WFDS team. Total acreage, we're looking at 2,364 acres, and approximately 50% of the control lines were also defined as pod boundaries, as you can see on that top portion. Again, subjective, I'd say the objectives that we set forth on this fire as a restoration fire, we looked at it probably at a 90 percentile objectives being met. With the Montoya Springs, early September, dominant oak brush, you can kind of see on that top figure. There was the result of a high intensity fire in 2002 that regenerated into a solid oak fields all the way around. And it used to be a ponderosa pine stand. You know, we tried again to meet objectives. I don't feel like we were as successful as we were on the Goudelet, but you know, we try and do what we can with what we got. All the values again were identified by a WFDS team, and we later found out, you know, that we didn't have all the values at risk identified, and that was one of the failures on our part as a WFDS team brought together. We didn't have a complete list of all the values at risk. Nothing truly impacted that couldn't be handled later on down the road, but there again, it was one of those failures that I take responsible. With the Montoya Springs fire, it was 2,950 acres. Approximately 30% of that, of the control lines, were also pod boundaries, with utilization of helitorch and hand ignitions. Again, with the objectives, I really didn't think we did as well as we should have. I called it a 40%, and then I shut down the operation just due to not meeting the objectives that I felt were necessary to continue on. With that, you know, the WFDS team, while important, it is subject to human factors. And what I'd like to see on some of these is having, you know, these pods bringing that container effect, having all the information that we can possibly provide in a static environment, and know what is there before we actually put boots on the ground. And I think we just need to be able to do a little bit more of that. And the pods would help if we could bring in all the information. I know they're populating a lot of that stuff currently, just, kind of waiting on the other stuff that's coming through. Again, valuable, just to kind of help that validation of WFDS, if you will. Mike, if you could roll the slide, please, sir. So the lessons learned on these two fires in the 2019 season, I think WFDS definitely needs the pods to be uploaded with everything known, and we need to make it in a digestible manner. I think I've heard it put best. And I don't know what that looks like, but there again, as we go through time and start putting the inputs in there, we'll start looking at what is digestible and static and usable, and start discarding what we don't see as viable. As I alluded to, the Montoya Springs, we didn't list the CDT trail, the Continental Divide Trail, as a value at risk, which is really unfortunate because it was one of the control lines, a small portion of it, about 1/10 of a mile, that has some caveats that we are required to do with a national trail. So that was one of those things that I just felt like we could have done a little bit better. Again, with the planning side of things, it makes a great container in the whole pods concept to be able to add the things that you think would be utilized in a wildfire situation or a prescribed fire situation. I know some forests are utilizing the risk assessments and putting those in there. I think that'd be a great tool on certain areas and certain portions of our pods within the Carson Santa Fe. I think that could be utilized. From the operational standpoint, it's a good tool. If provided with complete values at risk list sooner than later. Values at risk with a pod could allow treatment for options with an imminently threatened value within that pod if you see it within the time frames allotted, considering that safety is going to be the forefront of everything that we're going to do. The likelihood of using pod boundaries varies on fuel conditions. And as Mike had spoken to, all the spatial data that they're bringing up is a great tool. And we just need to be able to, when we're doing the boots on the ground truthing this portion of it, the thing we got to realize is, as fire managers, we're the ones that went out and ground truthed it. But there again, that next manager is going to see things a little bit different. It's just the human factors that we have. So I don't know how we could control that any better than we are right now. But, ultimately, it's going to be dependent on the fire season, the fire severity, and the fire manager as to what that pod boundary looks like. Apologize, looking at my notes going on. So with the communications, again, it's a great tool. I've used it several times over the course of the last 2 years, just talking with the agency administrators. Internally, there is no better tool, as far as getting the information out, bringing that common operating picture together with the agency administrator, making sure we're on the same page and we're not doing something that he does not want done as my boss at that point. Externally, it works equally as well. Kind of that briefing events that you're looking for, whether it be stakeholders or just general public, or anybody that you're looking at, as needs to bring that information out. You can bring out the information and bring pods into it. Most likely in the Southwest, they have already seen or actually heard of pods. What they know of it is going to be determined on, their local knowledge of that. And I think the more we bring it out, the more information we can bring to them, the better off we'll be, and they'll enjoy that. Again, the information shops, the same thing. I do agree. Mike, if you could roll on the next slide. So 2020, what a year it was for everything. And it's a year to remember, and that's for sure. I don't have a whole lot of knowledge about the pods and the Atlas. Well, the pods Atlas anyway, sorry about that. But 2019, the COVID-19 issues that came forth in 2020 was kind of the driving factor for all strategies. You know, they show the Medio fire. I came in, I used to work on the Santa Fe district, and I came in to help out those folks over there for the initial onset while they were getting a team in place for the extended attack. So again, with the pods, I only had one at the point of time while I was there, one pod that was involved in the fire anyway. And it allowed us to rapidly show and develop from the values at risk that were already listed in there, and kind of communicate that to the tribal officials that we were talking with, as well as the agencies folks. Don't have a whole lot more on the 40% of the control lines were utilized. I would imagine so. Most of these control lines within the pod boundaries are, good road systems. Yeah, that's not all I have. From there, I will kick it over to Kit O'Connor.
Okay, let's see here. All right. Where am I? Here we go. Okay, let's see if I can get this to come up. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yep, and we're seeing that slide. Yeah, the 2020 slide.
Okay, and you're not seeing my notes slide, correct?
Oh,
great. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Jamie, for the rundown on the Carson National Forest and also kind of that foreboding introduction to the 2020 fire season. We knew it was going to be a very challenging season for wildfire and a real test of this framework that we've been rolling out since 2016. And what we found is in kind of I would hate to say it, but in like a softball fire season, where we have a lot of opportunity and not a lot of demand on our resources, this framework works really well. But when we start to get into these more emergency type situations, and especially with COVID-19 and the real emphasis on initial attack and trying to keep everything as small as possible, because there's just so much uncertainty about the fire season this year, we didn't expect the pods process to be leveraged as much because we expected a much more suppression oriented response this year. But it actually came back to surprise us that it was unfortunate that there were just a lot of escaped fires. And really the pods system is best designed to deal with those escape fires and with those extended attack events. And so while there was a real emphasis on initial attack, and it was very effective in a lot of places, especially like up here in Montana and in Region 1, man, the Southwest, California, and Colorado just got hammered with these large events under extreme conditions. And that's actually where, given the right amount of information, the pod system shined, but also under extreme conditions, we noticed a lot of failures too. So I'm gonna touch on this a little bit, but I want to make sure I leave time for some questions. So I don't want to speak too much about this. Real quickly, just an overview, just to give you a sense of the scale of the work that was done in 2020 specifically. We supported 66 incidents nationwide. Just using regions 1 through 5. Region 6 actually had its own individual kind of pod network support group that did a bunch of independent support. So in total, I would estimate we supported approximately 75 large wildfires this year. Just for perspective, between 2017 and 2019, over those 3 years, we averaged about 25 fires per year. So we went up basically threefold this year That was based on requests and then based on the pre-positioning of a lot of information, ramping up. We basically switched over to fire support mode in February and March this year, understanding that with COVID-19, this was going to be serious. Mike already touched on the specific products, the kind of the individual components that go into that pod network. So I'm not going to belabor those, but they're listed here. And those are some of the components that we worked with, moving with the risk management assistance group this year. So real quickly, to give you a sense of what was different in 2020, this was the first time that we actually had a web interface that allowed the entire network of pods that have been developed to date for the entire Western US available for end users to see and to leverage. And so we actually had wall-to-wall where pods have been developed, basically almost all of Region 3, all of Region 6, much of Region 5, much of Region 1, and much of Region 2. We now have these pod networks in place. And we actually got to leverage these this year much more efficiently and explicitly than in years past. What we also did is we started pre-positioning things like suppression difficulty index, like the potential control locations atlas, up to 2 or 3 months before we even had ignitions on the ground. And that was because we all got diverted away from our standard research tasks specifically to fire support this year. Another big thing that we did is, for any of you that were in the Southwest and were aware of the desert fuels this year were pretty phenomenal, as they were last year. Last year was thought of as a really unprecedented El Nino type event where there was just 2 and 3 foot tall grasses throughout the Sonoran Desert system. That was amplified even further this last year. And so what we were able to do was systematically update the fuel models for 2020 before we even started doing any modeling. And that actually even allowed us to provide some of these fuel models to teams on the ground so that they had better data than they could get from any of the other national data systems. And then with that, that all just coincided with this massive increase in demand for the pod-based products and their precursors. So as Jamie mentioned, these were definitely atypical conditions. The focus of 2020 was supposed to be around initial attack and keeping fires as small as possible. And that worked where conditions allowed that to happen. But when escapes happened, then really it's this pod process. It's identifying these best available extended attack locations that really worked to our advantage. It also really helped aid with these triage type decisions. We hate to have to make these trade-offs. If we're going to lose something, what are we going to lose, and how do we position our resources so that we save as much as we possibly can? By knowing where those values at risk are and knowing where our control opportunities are, this helped with some of those really difficult triage type decisions. And then one of the things that we did see, though, was that because a lot of these products during the fire season get ordered by individual incident management teams, there were some challenges with transferring information among teams on those 2-week rotation cycles. And another thing we saw was that because there were so many type 1 and type 2 incidents this year that really had elevated resource use, and teams were just getting flown all over the country, we didn't necessarily always have great alignment with the local agency administrators and those local teams, oftentimes who had the better information on where values at risk were, where the best suppression opportunities were. So we saw some of those challenges out there. Jimmy already spoke to this too. Some of the challenges to use of some of these things are familiarity. These products are still not in a national system of education for wildfire managers yet. That's something that we're working toward, but not something we've achieved yet. And so it's still on the job training for these. So as people see them, they get more and more comfortable with them. But at the same time, this year specifically, there were so many extreme conditions that we actually started to see breakdowns in some of these products. We saw that, under 80-mile-an-hour winds, or under the Southwest monsoon conditions, where we just never got a wet green up period this summer, we just had these incredibly long fire seasons where even a fire that we thought was out could skunk around for 2 or 3 weeks and then reignite and keep spreading. So there were a number of real challenges out there. Another thing that we noticed and that came up from some of these discussions was, as we create these pod boundaries, it's going to be absolutely critical to identify not just is this a control feature, but what's the quality of that control feature, and under what conditions is it likely to hold, and under what conditions is it likely to fail. These are just some quick examples of what those pod networks look like, overlaid with just the 2020 fires from this year. And you can see kind of how these pod boundaries intersect with a lot of these fires. Another one of the innovations we had is we could project these in Google Earth. So we could actually track in real time using various satellite imagery as fires were growing. We could see where they were contacting these pod boundaries. This actually was really, really useful on one of the fires outside of Tucson, the Bighorn Fire, for example, where they leveraged these pod boundaries exclusively, but under the extreme conditions, this fire ended up being over 100,000 acres. And if you can see at the very top of the mountain range up here, there's a tiny little pod around the town of Summerhaven. And given basically 2.5 weeks of notice that this entire pod was likely to burn out, as could have been the one behind it, there was a huge investment in enforcing these pod boundaries. And for the Bighorn Fire, they didn't lose a single structure or have any significant damage to the infrastructure that was there, because they had the time built off of their pod network and some of the modeling that was showing them that this was going to be a large extended use event. Some of the failures, or just some of the challenges of this system, are these fires like the Cameron Peak or the East Troublesome from Colorado, where you can see multiple pods being challenged by these fire boundaries. And in the end, oftentimes we do see the final alignment of where containment occurring on these pod boundaries, but there were an awful lot of breaches that happened too. And a lot of that was driven by extreme winds, extreme fuel conditions, and then just these fires that just refuse to go out. Some of these fires burned for more than 2.5 months. With this alignment came a whole series of new analytics that we've been developing on the fly to help aid with those decision tools. I'm not going to go into these because I don't have time, but this is kind of part of the future of where we're heading with risk management assistance. Here's an example of what one of those looks like. This is an idea of, if you're going to propose building new fire line to try and contain a fire, you can pull up something like Suppression Difficulty Index, and you can visualize where the most challenging locations to build a fire line and where are the areas where you have that opportunity. And you can pull those out directly. So real quickly, some of the things that we learned are understanding the difference between, say, a core pod boundary that we think is going to hold under a lot of conditions versus these provisional pod boundaries that maybe are more suitable for prescribed fire or the shoulder season conditions. And understanding there's a difference between each of these types of pod boundaries, and those need to be defined. And it's really important to account for things like spotting, winds, and these seasonal fuel changes. As Jamie alluded to, values at risk. If we have values at risk at our fingertips using something like that pod atlas that Mike spoke to, that dramatically improves our ability to make these types of decisions. And if we can build a catalog of conditions and outcomes so we have an understanding of when things hold up and when things fail. Real quickly, one of the things that we picked up from the 2020 after action review was that it was the pre-season planning and the pre-positioning of data that was the huge asset this year, and that was the only thing that got us ahead of some of these fires. And with that, the Washington office has now created a national priority for some of this work. Speaking to the integration with the Wildfire Decision Support System for the next generation that's coming out next year, we're looking at ways that we can actually introduce a lot of these analytics and make them available for users to leverage in real time, either as a pre-positioned product or something that they can customize within WFDS. Right now, WFDS doesn't have this type of flexibility. It doesn't have a great way to host values at risk. And one of the other real drawbacks is you can upload a lot of things to WFDS, but you oftentimes can't download them after the fact. So what we'd like to do is create much more of a working database where if you upload information into WFDS, you can also pull it down with additional information from fires, for example. Real quickly, moving into the future directions, the pod summary tool has already been touched on a bit, but I think as we expand this out, as we streamline this process, That was one of the original functions we thought of WFDS back in 2011, 2012. Unfortunately, it became clear in about 2015 that the level of detail needed by incident management teams to use something like pods to summarize values wasn't, that capability didn't exist in the current form of WFDS. And so we think WFDS Next Gen and some of these outside of WFDS tools can get us there. The other thing is looking at the dancing pods, so this idea of the risk profile itself, so the strategic response zones themselves change as conditions change on the ground, and then which of these control features are actually functional under which conditions. So that gets to the dancing control features as well. And then we're looking at integration of things like snags, escape routes, and other operational challenges. We have active models in development for those things. And this is all around this idea of improved incident level analytics and pre-positioning of information. The last thing I'd like to do is just do a quick shout out for a pod users work group that we are planning for mid-February. I actually have a meeting on that in about an hour and a half, and we'll be detailing a bit more of it. But the idea is to have practitioners on the ground, researchers, line officers, Washington office input. So we really start to develop more of a national strategy around the use of these products and how they can become more standardized, but also strengthen them and tailor them to the specific locations where they're likely to be used. So with that, I just want to conclude and open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. You guys covered a lot of ground, and I really enjoy seeing the connection between sort of what happened this year and some of the larger planning for, the new WFDS, et cetera. So thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, definitely. I encourage our participants to type questions in the chat window. We don't have a ton of time, but we can probably bleed over a little bit after 1 o'clock here in New Mexico. So feel free, and there are a few of us on here that we can actually just, if you want to unmute your line and ask a question verbally, feel free to do that as well. And I guess it's not fully formed in my head, but I'm fascinated by both Jamie and Kit kind of touching on this issue of getting values at risk into WFDS. Well, maybe they're already in the pods atlas, and so it maybe I don't know if either of you want to build on that a little bit. It sounds like there's some fix essentially for that coming in WFDS 2, but that does sound like a pretty important link.
Yeah, I would just say, unfortunately, the infrastructure that the current version of WFDS was built around is just not capable of hosting the level of detail of information. It's not a GIS friendly environment. And so the thought behind the new WFDS is it will be much more of just a clearinghouse to display much more sophisticated information. And in the meantime, work like what Mike is working on and what the RMA group are working on is kind of the workaround until WFDS is able to ingest this type of information, is to have other ways to distribute this type of data, hopefully to teams as well.
Great. And Emma typed a question in the chat window, and she asks, for incorporating past fires into your models for pods creation, how old is too old, or is that fuel dependent? And there's another question, but let's start, we'll do one at a time here.
I guess I can speak to that too. Yeah, so the main thing is we want to make sure that it is fuels dependent. We only use fires that we have a good pre-fire fuel model for, so we can understand what were the conditions like when that fire was burning. So what that means for us is the earliest version of land fire is from 2001. So right now we're only using fires 2002 onward. Well, and that probably, I mean, Jamie or Mike is probably more expert at this, but it seems like at least in Southwestern fuel types, often we think about 10 years
you know, as being like a rough guess. So it sounds like you got a lot of that covered. The second question from Emma is, she says, this has been super informative. Thank you all. I may have missed this, but is there another purpose of pods to make recommendations about management strategies, i.e. full suppression versus wildland fire use / managed for resource benefit?
And we might not have made that explicitly clear, but in one of the first slides I showed, it has a color-coded pod map. You know, the red, the yellow, the green. So that color coding scheme, the protect, the maintain, and the restore, yeah, that is exactly what you're talking about. It uses the pod boundaries as containers, and it summarizes the risk assessment data in such a way that managers have an idea what that strategic response should be, although that strategic response may or may not change depending on the conditions. Whether it's a good candidate to suppress the fire immediately, or like Jamie hinted to, are the conditions such that it should be managed for resource benefit.
Hey guys, this is Emily. I have a question for Kit or for anyone. Kit, can you say any more about the Washington office making this a priority and there being a national strategy around pods?
Yeah, so that's one of the challenges that we've been given by Fire and Aviation Management, and specifically the purse string holders of FAM, is if we can develop a strategy for personnel to make sure that this becomes something that can be hosted either at the regional level or at some kind of other center of excellence, that this right now is the most cohesive strategy we have going forward for integrating land and resource management planning and fire directly.
Thank you, that's helpful.
And I can jump in and answer Bill's question. He talks about on the pod scale in the images that we showed. Some fires were much smaller than the pods. Some fires were much larger than a single pod. And what does that look like? So the question is, do we anticipate any conditions where a fire would be allowed to burn an entire pod and also contained within that pod? This is a balancing act. That yes, the short answer is yes. We do find examples. We do have conditions in which an ignition in a pod kind of expands out and is kept within that single pod. The conditions have to be right. What we saw in some of the fires that Jamie spoke to in 2019, it was a very moderate year, and those fires were never going to grow out to that pod edge. It was just way too far. We saw images the Kit showed on the Cameron Peak fire in particular, where there were some extreme conditions and those pod lines were not holding. So they had to back out to the next pod and figure out what made sense. What I want to illustrate is that these pod lines represent the most effective control lines on the landscape. It's not necessarily saying they will be effective. And what we do highly recommend is that as soon as you think you might need to use that line, you should reinforce that line, either in the pre-planning where you do a fuels treatment or a prescribed fire in order to buffer that line, strengthen that, or in the incident if it's a burnout operation or you get some heavy equipment in order to widen that line. So this is just one option if you choose to, if you're going indirect, either for resource benefit or for safety and firefighter exposure concerns. This is one good option. It's not your only option. You can always go direct. And so, we do have some examples of where that fire fills up that pod, very nicely. More often we see that the fire used 30% of the boundary as a pod. Hopefully that answers your question, Bill.
Yeah, I think That helped me, certainly. Thank you, Mike. And then maybe our last comment that came in the chat window here, Michael says, I think another offshoot is to look at the pod boundaries to see where new work might be needed. To be able to visualize it like this is really interesting. So I think that sort of touches on the Google Earth and some of that pre-planning. So that's a good addition. I don't know if there's any comment building on that.
We are starting to see this being used as a fuels planning tool. Understanding where those lines are can certainly help you figure out if you should put a fuels treatment there. We're seeing some instances where pod boundaries are used for contingency lines on fires. Even if the fire never makes it to that contingency line, those contingency lines can be prepped as a prescribed fire boundary in the future. So yes, we do see lots of opportunities for kind of crosswalking operational fire management with fuels planning and natural resource management much more generally.
I would also add that as we get better at characterizing the quality of the control features and we map those out in relation to the values at risk, then it really does pop out. Where are the areas where we have both a diminished ability to stop a fire and a heightened need to stop a fire? And where that happens, then that really brings in the need to consider if you have limited resources, those are the areas you really need to enforce.
Great. Well, I think with that, we're a little bit over time. We should probably wrap up, but I want to take the time to thank you three again. A great combination of perspectives, and I think I've been trying to learn about pods over the years, and I feels like it's really finally coming together. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and thanks for having us. We really appreciate the opportunity, and the questions were spot on, and yeah, just really happy to have this discussion and bring this concept forward.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. I'll go ahead and shut down the meeting.